Hi everyone, it's great to be here for Sexy MF30. Thank you so much to D'Angela for organizing another amazing event and for inviting me here to talk about the Love Symbol album and Three Chains of Gold, a project so wonderfully bizarre that I can't help but love it. So let's get started. Prince famously billed the Love Symbol album as a fantasy rock soap opera, which fueled much of its reception upon its release in 1992. At the time, rock opera was the main framework we had to understand a pop album that told a story. The format had been around since the late 1960s, when it was mainly the province of British progressive rock groups. The first person to coin the actual phrase rock opera was Pete Townshend of The Who, whose 1969 album Tommy is often considered the definitive example of the form. In retrospect, we can also give credit to The Who's contemporaries, the Pretty Things, for releasing the first narrative rock album, if not technically rock opera, with 1968's SF Sorrow. Rock operas, song cycles, whatever we want to call them, remained in vogue through the progressive rock era in the 1970s, with Pink Floyd's 1979 The Wall one of the more successful examples. By 1992, though, the term rock opera, or even the slightly less hoary concept album, brought with it more than a whiff of pretension. Prince's tweak of the genre to rock soap opera sounded a deliberately self-parodic note, seemingly intended to preempt the critics from accusations that he was taking himself too seriously. As you can see, however, it didn't quite work. With a few exceptions, mainly John Bream, whose negative review Prince infamously set alight on the Arsenio Hall show, the Love Symbol album's music was widely praised, but its story was almost universally panned as slight and incomprehensible, most explicitly by Richard Harrington of the Washington Post, who wrote, "I knew Tommy, and this is no Tommy." For the record, I don't think that's an entirely fair criticism. In fact, the rock opera has arguably never worked as a medium for standalone narrative. Even many of the canonical examples can only be understood with the aid of supplementary materials. Several key plot points from Tommy, for example, only made sense after Townshend explained them in interviews. Besides, we know that the Love Symbol album was never really supposed to stand on its own. Its story was further explored in a comic book called Three Chains of Gold, written by acclaimed comics writer Dwayne McDuffie, as well as a direct-to-video movie, also called Three Chains of Gold, albeit with slightly different punctuation, directed by Prince himself with Randy St. Nicholas and Paris Patton. And in fact, as many of you are no doubt yelling at your computers right now, more or less the same story was also told on stage in the Act 1 tour and on television in the two-part Act 1 and Ride Divine TV special. In other words, despite his self-deprecating rock soap opera neologism, Prince was actually doing something a lot more ambitious than a rock opera. So ambitious, in fact, that we wouldn't have a name for it for another 10 years, when in the mid-2000s, media scholar Henry Jenkins coined the phrase transmedia storytelling. So what exactly is transmedia storytelling? I'll let Dr. Jenkins explain. In his 2007 book, Convergence Culture, Jenkins writes, "A transmedia story unfolds across multiple media platforms, with each new text making a distinctive and valuable contribution to the whole." In the ideal form of transmedia storytelling, each medium does what it does best. Each franchise entry needs to be self-contained. Any given product is a point of entry in the franchise as a whole. So Convergence Culture uses the Wachowskis' Matrix franchise, and in particular the third film, 2003's The Matrix Revolutions, as its exemplar of transmedia storytelling. While a more traditional movie franchise would only expect the viewer to have seen the prior films in the series, The Matrix Revolutions includes characters who were more thoroughly explored in Enter the Matrix, a video game released alongside the previous film. It also explicitly picks up plot threads that originated in the animated anthology film The Animatrix. You don't need to have played Enter the Matrix or watched The Animatrix to follow the basic plot of The Matrix Revolutions, but doing so will arguably result in a richer experience. Something to which I can personally attest, having recently rewatched The Matrix Revolutions without any background knowledge beyond the earlier films, and left thoroughly underwhelmed. To see how Jenkins' transmedia definition works with the Love Symbol franchise, let's take a quick look at the respective storylines of the album, comic, and film. But first, a few caveats. I'm not going to go into a ton of forensic detail here because I know that Edgar Cruz is on this panel after me and he owns the patent on going into forensic detail about Prince. I also know that a lot of the story of the Love Symbol album ended up being cut from the final version, but I'm going to ignore that for now and just stick with what a listener would have heard after buying the album in 1992. So with these caveats in mind, the Love Symbol album is really just like the title of this presentation. Your average 320-year-old rock star beats Jailbait Middle Eastern princess story. We open with the introduction of Prince. Prince and Maite meet. We follow their courtship. Prince has a moral dilemma about their courtship. He gets over it and they consummate the relationship. He hangs up on the reporter, Vanessa Bartholomew, played by Kirstie Alley for reasons best summed up as 1992. He and Maite struggle with sexual incompatibility. They resolve their sexual incompatibility. There's some pillow talk, more sex, more pillow talk. Prince and Vanessa have a contentious interview. Prince declares war against the 7 deadly sins, also possibly journalists. He declares his eternal love to Maite. They might be having marital issues. He gets really into Queen, and then he calls Vanessa back for another interview and finally reveals something of himself to her. It isn't Shakespeare, but again, it isn't supposed to be. And the way the story beats work in concert with the songs actually reminds me less of a rock opera per se, and more of the experience of listening to a cast recording of a musical. You're hearing just part of the story without the context of the book. The book is the 3 Chains of Gold comic, which helps us fill in some of those gaps. Maite's vague, out-of-context speech from 3 Chains of Gold, the song, has become the whole frame for the story. Her father, the monarch of a fictional Middle Eastern nation called Eric, was assassinated in a coup attempt by her uncle, and now she needs Prince's help to protect the 3 Chains of Turin, which her uncle needs to take the throne because comic books. You can see how, as Jenkins suggested, the specificities of the comics medium, and specifically the superhero genre, shape this version of the story. There's a lot of action, for one thing. The Max is the soundtrack for one of several elaborate fight scenes, and McDuffie uses familiar genre tropes to fill out Prince's bare-bones original story. Maite's fictional uncle is basically a supervillain here, and by the end, Vanessa Bartholomew is in cahoots with him because of course she is. You'll hear a lot more about this from Robert Loss's presentations shortly, so consider this a brief preview. Finally, we have the 3 Chains of Gold movie, which is less tightly plotted than the comic book. Neither Prince nor Randy St. Nicholas ever wrote for DC Comics, and frankly, it shows. But it also adds new layers to the more personal love story depicted on the album. St. Nicholas may not have been a storyteller, but she was an accomplished photographer, and you can see her contributions in the occasionally surreal visual richness of many of the film's scenes. Rather than a boring traditional concert, for example, the My Name is Prince sequence takes place during a full-blown riot, with Prince brandishing a gold gun-shaped microphone and obscuring his face with a veil of gold chains under a police hat. The 3 Chains film also takes advantage of the direct-to-video medium with a lot of gratuitous nudity, from Maite going skinny dipping with her chambermaids to what can only be described as the roller skating sex nightmare she has during I Want to Melt With You. As in Jenkins' definition of transmedia, knowledge of the comic, for example, isn't required to enjoy the film or vice versa. If anything, spend too much time thinking about any of these storylines and you'll just get more confused. But what the interplay between these 3 texts does is create a richer sense of the world Prince created. Transmedia storytelling, Jenkins writes, is an example of the art of world building, as artists create compelling environments that cannot be fully explored or exhausted within a single work or even a single medium. Now, I obviously don't think Prince was the first thing that came to Jenkins' mind when he wrote those words, but maybe he should have been, because I think it also goes without saying for everyone gathered here that Prince was a world builder par excellence. In fact, it's arguable that Love Symbol was not his first transmedia rodeo. Think about Purple Rain, for example. The movie, the album, and the tour all offer different ways of exploring the same essential story and aesthetic. Even when Prince was playing in somebody else's toy box, he also had an incredible knack for making it his own. For example, seeing Jack Nicholson as the Joker dance to Trust in Tim Burton's 1989 Batman movie is one thing. Hearing Prince on the soundtrack album singing Scandalous, to date one of relatively few sexy slow jams canonically written from the perspective of Batman, is something else. And lastly, seeing Prince invent his own Batman character whole cloth for the Bat Dance music video, a combination of Batman, the Joker, Two-Face, and of course Prince himself, known as Gemini, is something else yet again. All of which is to say that I think Prince fans were uniquely prepared for his leap into the deep end of transmedia storytelling in 1992, in a way that most traditional rock critics were not. We were used to absorbing his artistic vision through a whole spectrum of different channels, Not only the recorded music, the album art, the music videos, the live shows, all the levels on which most artists engaged, but also his entire look. Our mutual friend Celie McInnes recently wrote in his newspaper about Prince as a semiotician, sharing Dr. Fink's famous line that whenever Prince changed his hairstyle, he knew that he was creating a new sound. Fans had been tuned into this side of Prince since at least the Controversy album in 1981. The act of engaging with his artistry had never really been limited to a single medium. What's more, we were used to finding pleasure in his world building regardless of, let's say, traditional standards of artistic quality. I'm going to make a controversial statement here and say that 3 Chains of Gold, any way you slice it, is not a great movie. But I will also say that a world in which the My Name is Prince chain hat did not exist would be a much poorer world indeed. It's this aspect of the fandom's deep relationship with the text that I believe truly aligns the Love Symbol Project with Jenkins' definition of transmedia storytelling. For Jenkins, transmedia texts are particularly well suited to a form of active consumption through what French cyber theorist Pierre Levy dubbed collective intelligence, which he summarizes with the aphorism, "No one knows everything, everyone knows something, all knowledge resides in humanity." Jenkins applies Levy's notion of collective intelligence to pop culture fandoms who delight in pooling their collective knowledge to dig deeper into the world of the text. In the case of the Matrix fandom, gathering information, tracing allusions, constructing timelines, assembling reference guides, transcribing dialogue, extending the story through their own fan fiction, and speculating like crazy about what it all meant. This kind of participatory culture is at the heart of how we relate to a successful transmedia text. So, you probably know where I'm going with all of this. Nowadays, if we want to understand what the hell the Love Symbol album was about, we can visit a website like Prince Vault, where some ridiculously knowledgeable fan-turned-researcher has transcribed the additional segues that were cut from the album before its release, making its storyline even more difficult to follow. We could even visit a less reputable website and actually hear those segues in the context of the original leaked album configuration. We could also do exactly what we're doing now. Come together and ignore our families for a weekend while we swap theories, readings, and hot takes about the Love Symbol album, informed by our respective academic disciplines and areas of research. At the 1+1+1=3 Symposium last year, I witnessed more than one full-throated defense of the song Jughead, and if that isn't collective intelligence, or at least collective insanity, then I don't know what is. My original thesis statement for this presentation was to say that Prince was, as usual, ahead of his time. He launched a fully credible transmedia narrative franchise almost a decade before The Matrix, Jenkins' apt choice for the transmedia urtext of the turn of the 21st century. But while I still think that's true, I also don't know that it's saying all that much. After all, if the Love Symbol album and 3 Chains of Gold had been released in 2002 and 2004 rather than 1992 and 1994, they still would have been received by critics as the goofy, self-indulgent, only sometimes intentionally funny vanity projects that they self-evidently are. I think perhaps the more cogent point to make is that goofy, self-indulgent, and at least sometimes intentionally funny vanity projects are exactly how we like it. With the Love Symbol album and its accompanying texts, Prince created a rich and utterly idiosyncratic world for us. 30 years later, we're still here, playing in it. Once again, thank you so much for indulging me yet again. Thank you, D'Angela, for putting this together. And I can't wait for the rest of the panels and to talk to you all after this is over. Thanks, and see you soon.